Welcome to the 15th Annual Anne and Laura Kieve Lecture hosted by Stanford Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. I'm Jennifer DeVere Brody, a professor in theater and performance studies, feminist, gender, and sexuality studies, as well as African and African American studies. I serve as the faculty director of CCSRE, where our mission is to look at scholarship on racial justice. I want to begin by acknowledging that we stand on unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone people. I want to give our deepest thanks to Anne and Laura Kieve, who for 15 years have endowed this lecture. With their support, this has become one of the most important and prestigious lectures, not only for CCSRE, but for the entire Stanford community. We've featured advocates, scholars, artists, some all three, as in tonight's artists, and all of whom have been leaders in the important work for racial justice. We are so grateful. Will you stand so we can acknowledge you, Loren? I also want to thank our many co-sponsors for this event, beginning with Stanford Live, under whose auspices our guests, Rhiannon Giddens and Francesco Turrisi, will give a concert tomorrow night in our beautiful Bing Auditorium. Also, our other Stanford sponsors include the Program in African and African American Studies, Stanford Arts, the Institute for Diversity in the Arts, Stanford Arts Institute, the Program in American Studies, the Department of Music, and the Stanford Humanities Center. It is a pleasure to be able also to thank the extraordinary staff at the center, especially Perlita Dicocheo, whom I must give a special announcement. She joined us very recently and has put the entire event together as a great leader with the rest of the team, but chose the theme of feathers, and I think it's just beautiful. So, Perlita, thank you so much. She was helped profoundly by Marco Flores, Nathan Coy from the Stanford Archive of Recorded Sound, Ben Stone of the Stanford Library, and the Griffin Stringed Instruments, all of whom organized the curatorial installation that I really hope you saw on your way into the auditorium tonight. It's really quite special. I also have to thank the rest of the staff, Marcia Challoner, Heidi Lopez, Byron Bejarona, our CSE-RE Undergraduate Council, Bridget Algie Hewitt, Rigoberto Marquez, and of course, Daniel Murray. Gracias, we acknowledge all of you and our board members, our steering committee who are here, and also the deans of H&S and the entire Stanford community, and especially you for coming out this evening. So, despite the violence, environmental crises, mass incarceration, and assaults on our constitutional democracy, there's a way in which art inspires. And in the theme tonight, There Is No Other, the title of the album from which we'll be hearing some selections tonight, it shows us the ways in which you can combat the historic way that power can sometimes dehumanize difference, right? So it's other with a capital O, which is to say we should not think about people not as people, but as othered. We are not merely byproducts of the modern state, colonial oppression, slavery, and the like. Artists like the ones we'll hear from tonight show us that a place is much larger and more complex than narrow nationalisms through their resilience, resistance, and refusal to limit their imaginations and therefore expand ours. I hope you listen tonight, learn, and think about what you hear. Now let me bring my colleague, Professor David Palumbo-Liu, the Nixon Professor of Comparative Literature, to the stage to give a formal introduction to our esteemed guests. Following the presentation by Rhiannon Giddens and Francesco Turrisi, our Executive Director, Dr. Daniel Murray, will join them on the stage for a Q&A, and we'll have open questions from the audience as well. And as Dr. Palumbo-Liu comes to the stage, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And just say welcome. Thank you so much.
Okay, so first of all, a clarification. It's not the Richard Nixon chair, okay? It's Louise Hewlett Nixon. Just, you know. And a second confession, I nagged my way into this gig. And they were so kind to let me do this because I'm such a huge fan of your music. I'm honored to introduce Rhiannon Giddens and Francesco Turrisi. I've been asked to explain how their work advances social justice, and I've been given 5 to 7 minutes. So, given that, I'm going to ask you to read their bios, and I'm going to try to cover the second part of things. Simply put, Rhiannon Giddens and Francesco Turrisi are the hands-down ideal people to give the Kieve lecture this year. Giddens is interested in restoring the proper history of blacks into the traditional musical culture of the US. Turrisi traces the traditions and paths of music across the Middle East and Europe. And their recent album, There Is No Other, merges these two projects, and it is nothing less than a musical miracle. Rhiannon's and Francesco's music does the opposite of what we've been accustomed to. They are carrying out these projects precisely at a time when ethno-nationalist figures are claiming the right to define who the folk is and speak for them to the exclusion of others. Sadly, we find the rise of different brands of supremacist thinking all over the globe, undergirded by the most warped notions of cultural history possible. Rhiannon's and Francesco's music continues and extends a progressive activist tradition and takes it further back in time and forward across different global and local spaces. And by progressive, I mean a tradition that both uncovers past erasures and evolves as the times demand. It shows that things that link us together and how bigotry is invested in obscuring those links. So in what follows, I want to focus on this idea of connections across races and across geopolitical spaces. It's going to take the shape of a story. I want to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to ask you to follow it very closely because there are lots of twists and turns. But trust me, at the end of 5 minutes, it will end up with Rhiannon Giddens and Francesco Turrisi. So like many, I came to folk music through white musicians. And I listened to Peter, Paul, and Mary. And I loved the song Freight Train. And as I learned more about it, I found out that it was written by Elizabeth Cotten, an African-American woman born in 1893 who died in 1987. I found out the song was not located anywhere near Bleecker Street, and that Peter, Paul, and Mary had obliterated the trademark finger-picking style of Elizabeth Cotten, for which she is known, and which she performed well into her 80s. And you can see marvelous YouTube videos of her. Still, I thank Peter, Paul, and Mary for seeding that path, and I remind us all that they marched for civil rights, and they were at the March on Washington in 1963. And one of the songs they sang was Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land, which was written in 1940 when the claim to a land was being threatened by runaway capitalism. But the songbooks and mainstream performances we usually heard omitted Guthrie's cutting verses about private property and welfare lines. Fortunately, Guthrie's young friend Pete Seeger restored these censored stanzas, and he also added one to include the Native American claim to the land. And this shows the idea of progress includes recognizing one's own omissions and filling them in. And the verse is, "This land is your land, but it once was my land. Before we sold you Manhattan Island, you pushed our nations to the reservations. This land was stole by you from me." Now here's where it gets interesting for the purposes of introducing tonight's speakers. As I said before, Elizabeth Cotten was born in 1893, but I didn't tell you she was born outside Chapel Hill, North Carolina, just a 50-minute drive from Rhiannon Giddens' birthplace in Greensboro. Now, we know Elizabeth Cotten as a guitar player, but her first instrument was the banjo. Like Rhiannon Giddens, she too was a musical prodigy. She wrote Freight Train in her early teens when she was working as a domestic. Later on, she landed a job at a department store, and she noticed a little girl who seemed to be lost. She helped the little girl find her mother, who turned out to be Ruth Crawford Seeger, a composer and the first female composer ever to win a Guggenheim Fellowship. The Seegers hired Elizabeth Cotten to work in their household as a maid. One of their sons happened to be Pete Seeger, who encouraged Elizabeth Cotten to relearn the guitar, an instrument she had not played in 25 years. This led to the rediscovery of one of the most important folk musicians in history. One final connection, Rhiannon Giddens appears in the Smithsonian's Folkways collection, Just Around the Bend, Survival and Revival in Southern Banjo Styles, Mike Seeger's last documentary, which follows Mike Seeger's last tour of Appalachia, and Mike was, of course, Pete Seeger's half-brother. So what I'm getting at with that story is that this pathway cuts across race, class, gender, and time, from a lost song to a lost little girl, to lost words, and even a lost instrument, to their recovery through acts of generosity and sharing and care, and a progressive musical tradition. So I'm going to end with this, and it goes directly to There Is No Other. I'm not a musicologist, I'm a literature professor, but there's a figure that links up not only literature and music, but also the graphic arts. It's a figure called the arabesque. It names a complex, nonlinear, multi-directional form associated with the Orient. Arabesques are found in the compositions of people like Debussy and Schumann, who were part of Europe's invention of the Orient, an Orient that was, of course, mediated by their knowledge of Iberian cultures. There's also a very famous contemporary novel by Anton Shammas called Arabesques. Shammas is a professor of literature. He's also a translator, novelist, and an activist, and his novel performs a very similar task as Giddens and Turrisi. Shammas is a Palestinian Christian. His first language is Arabic, but he wrote arabesques in Hebrew. Friends I know who know both languages say it's a tour de force in demonstrating the intimate and unbreakable connection between Arabic and Jewish culture and history. Shammas's novel restores a Middle Eastern culture alongside and outside the European fantasy of the Orient, and points to the common interests they have in living together. Likewise, Giddens and Turrisi stress the importance of understanding the rootedness of culture, as well as its exportability and recombinatory poetics, both for aesthetic and political reasons. Culture can be driven underground, but it can always reemerge, strengthened and nurturing, and this is what is done in the music of the two great musicians and activists we are about to hear. So please join me in welcoming Rhiannon Giddens and Francesco Turrisi.
That was amazing. I was like, oh no, don't stop. Are we gonna play first, or what are you gonna do? Yeah, okay. I just want to say this though, because I'm gonna forget it. I had to remind myself there when you talked about This Land Is Your Land. I also listened to a lot of Peter Paul and Mary when I was younger. But This Land Is Your Land was originally When the World's on Fire. It was a gospel song. The tune was taken, and then the words were written. And I think that's kind of apropos for right now. So I had to just throw that in there. We're going to start at the beginning, which is always tuning.
And the middle and the end as well.
Well, that's the very first tune that Francesco and I jammed on. We discovered a lot through that. That tune on the banjo is from 1855, and it's from the Briggs Banjo Instructor, the very first printed music published for the banjo in America. And
From my part, it was quite a spontaneous idea. I heard this music which I'd never heard before, and I just heard this sound, which is the Southern Italian tambourine, which we call tamburello. So all of these techniques comes traditionally, most of them. Some of them are more from the Arabic word, but from Southern Italy. But we'll tell you a lot more about that. This is just the beginning.
so, are you going now?
No?
No.
Well,
Should I click the next one?
sure.
Aha. So this is kind of where we all start. This is how you know how nerdy we are. These were our first conversations. Was about minstrelsy. This is the very first form of minstrelsy that we're most familiar with, the very first minstrel band. And what we first started to talk about was the idea. I hadn't really thought much about the tambourine being part of the minstrel show until I met Francesco. And then I was sending him images of minstrel bands going, hey.
On WhatsApp. That's
On
how we were
WhatsApp.
chatting, sending each other. I think we're in a safe space among nerds here, right? So for me, what was really interesting was, first of all, to see the tambourine. I think this is about to feedback.
It's
really, really hot here. Can we maybe turn down a tiny
Yeah,
bit?
thank you.
Yes? Is that better? Yeah.
Oh.
So, the tambourine. Well, first of all, I was surprised to see the tambourine, because it's obviously a traditional thing where I come from, but in the modern world, the tambourine is not really considered a very exciting instrument, right? Most of the time people think you're just going to shake it and hit your leg with it, but it's actually an instrument that has a huge history and tradition. So I was curious about this. But one of the most interesting things was looking at this tambourine player on the left and seeing the way he's holding the tambourine. Which is kind of like this, right? And this is the way we hold the tambourine all over the Mediterranean, right? So I've seen tambourines in the America because I know they exist, and I've seen African American styles of tambourine playing. But all of the ones I've seen, they hold the drum like this. It's a very, very different technique, with the thumb over. So if you go to Brazil, they have a drum called pandeiro there, which is held like this. And then I had seen gospel tambourine in church, also held like this, or New Orleans tambourine, also held like this. So this kind of sparked a little bit my imagination, and I said, I wonder what the connection is there. I wonder if there is a connection. And I started on this impossible quest of trying to connect this tambourine with the Italian style of tambourine, So maybe you can show the next picture. I'm sure you've all seen it, but this is a gospel tambourine, and you can see the hand inside. It's a very different kind of technique. So a lot of the early minstrel techniques seem to hold the tambourine in this very way. Now, when we had this little jam the first time we made a little video just by chance, and we posted it out there. And this sparked actually a very interesting conversation online, because these things happen these days. And quite a few people said, well, you are kind of trying to recreate what happened back then, And one of the people that we met is an interesting guy called Richard Graham, who's a scholar, researcher, but also a musician, a bit like us. I mean, I'm not really a scholar. I consider myself amateur researcher, I guess, an airplane researcher, I say, because I spend a lot of time on airplanes reading books. So I reached out to Richard because I was interested in trying to figure out how did they actually play this tambourine back then, because these type of instruments don't have notation unlike the banjo that had manuals and treatises at the time. Tambourine didn't have anything written out, So he told me, well, you should look into the Janissary bands and the black tambourinist of the English army. And I was like, the what? I had no idea what he was talking about. So maybe we can move on to the next picture. So this is the Coldstream Guards. Are you familiar with the Coldstream Guards? They are the ones at the Buckingham Palace, right? They had a marching band. This is from circa 1800. And it's a fascinating picture. So The Coldstream Guards had basically a harmony band, as they call it. It was a wind ensemble. To the left, around this time, they were actually all Germans. It's very interesting. Then you see some very small people, which I discovered today who they are. By the way, reading a book on the airplane on the way here. They are kids, actually. The two tiny microscopic figures in the front are kids. And also the whole fife and drums ensemble are kids. They were part of the marching parade. They had a fife and drums set up, which is the one in the back, and also some percussionists. And then you see three black men in turbans with percussion instruments, right? Now, what the hell is this, you might wonder? And that was my first question as well. Now, are you all familiar with the Janissaries? Do you know what the Janissaries were? The Janissaries was a division of the Ottoman Empire army. They were actually protecting the Sultan themselves. And the Janissary had a music band which went to war on the field, which was very feared and very fearsome, apparently. They had lots of big drums and loud brass instruments. And this concept of Janissary band became extremely popular with a form of Orientalism. Since you mentioned it, this is going to be a lot about that. That was only in the 19th century in mainland Europe. So what happened is that in 18th century, all the way into the 19th century, England was actually quite late into this trend. A lot of the army's marching bands tried to build their own version of what they thought was a Janissary music band. The reality is that they actually didn't know, because obviously there was no internet, and the only people who actually saw the Janissary bands were the people who were close enough to the Ottoman Empire, you know. So the King of Poland apparently received, because he was quite friendly with the Ottoman Sultan, received as a gift actually a Janissary band, a whole Janissary band with musicians. And I think maybe in the next shot we can see this was a real Janissary band. These are some miniatures from 1720, so you can see the giant drums, cymbals, trumpets on this side. On the other one, you can also see some kind of oboe type of instruments, or double reed instruments that are still called zurnas. They're very popular in Turkey. And nakare are those instruments on the ground. So anyway, maybe just go back to the one before. So anyway, the Janissary band. So this became a trend that went along with this idea of Orientalism, or what people thought was a Janissary band. And in the Coldstream Guards, it was, I think, in 1789, for the first time, 3 black men were appointed in the Turkish music section, they called this. Now, all of these 3 guys were African American, believe it or not. They were African American. It's not really clear. Some of them might have been freed, some of them might have been enslaved to escape and kind of enrolled in the army. But we know that the first 3 were actually African American. And they played bass drum. The tambourine is the one on the right side, held quite low. And cymbals, this is quite weird, doesn't really look like the large cymbals that they've had. Now, their job was to basically display some kind of a acrobatic percussion thing, which was obviously completely made up, not based on, they had no idea what Turkish music sounded like. But, as I was saying before, this Orientalist fashion, which was very popular in mainland Europe throughout the 18th century and all the way to the beginning of the 19th century, became huge. You've all heard of the Mozart Turkish March? Yeah, that's exactly that. It was an example of what is called Turkish music. Mozart wrote it, Beethoven wrote it. It's in Haydn Symphony. It's in Gluck operas. It was everywhere. It became so popular that the pianos at the time, they started building pianos which had a Turkish stop, which was a pedal with a mallet that hit the frame of the piano to create a bass drum effect, and a triangle that created a jingling sound. So so you could actually hit it while you were playing this Turkish music and create this effect of percussive idea. So their idea of Turkish music was, we take an African American, obviously black person, put them in a very exuberant turban, and give them a tambourine, basically, which was not an instrument that was in the Janissary bands. So even more, this sparked my imagination. I was like, okay, so what were these guys playing? Where it's like, there is no tambourine really in the African, especially West African tradition. There isn't. There is some tambourine in North Africa, more connected to the Arabic word, but the real style of rik, which is the Arabic tambourine, is developed a little later, as far as we know. And it's a very different type of drum, much smaller, so it couldn't be that kind of connection. So what did they play? Now, this leads into another interesting discovery. So these tambourine players were so popular, they were kind of like rock stars. So they were playing and dancing and jumping around, basically, by the description that we have at the time. This became so popular that the tambourine, basically at the beginning of the 19th century in London, became an instrument which was fashionable for the young ladies to learn. Now this is crazy, right? So they were learning the piano, they were learning the harp, and they were learning the tambourine. And you know who taught them the tambourine? These guys. Can you believe it? We have lots of documentation of, which is already a mind-blowing thing if you think of the like well-to-do early 19th century English society. It was going to take a black person to teach a young lady the tambourine, right? So what happens with this is that a whole amateur market of tambourine making and tambourine writings started. For instance, Muzio Clementi, I don't know if any of you studied the piano, if you studied his Clementi sonatas, wrote a piece for 12 waltzes for piano with tambourine accompaniment, right? So the interesting thing is, as it always happened with the amateur market, it was that people started writing treatises in the same way of the banjo, right? So we have 3 instructions for the tambourine manuals. Let me see if I have them. Okay, well, let's talk about this guy for a second. James Frazier, the name says it all already. This was one of the 3 first tambourinists of the Cold String Guards. So he was African American. Apparently, we don't know where from. There's some speculation here. Might be North Carolina because of the Scottish Highland name. He played the tambourine. They had this beautiful ornate tambourine. And now a woman did this painting and a print, which was apparently very popular because this guy was really popular, was a bit of a rock star. And she wrote this poem, which I think is very interesting. I'm sure you're all reading it because I can see it. You are. And so, do you want to go maybe to that? Have you guys all read it? Had enough time? Not yet? Yeah? Oh yeah, this is another one. Maybe just go to the next one first that I show you. This is the Dale's musical instructions for the tambourine. Right, there is no standard notation for tambourine, so these guys had to invent from scratch a way to write down the music for tambourine. And this is an incredible treasure because we know, otherwise we wouldn't have a clue, right? So this is all the different strokes in this book. There is another 2 treatises that every single one of them has got their own notation. So I've been going through a lot of these things, and a lot of them are very highly acrobatic kind of techniques. Like all this whirly stuff on the right side, they're all big spins. So their tambourines were a little bit different. First of all, they change in size. They said that the English army tambourines were sometimes as big as this, literally. So massive drums. So they played in this very acrobatic style that had a lot of spin where the tambourine turned around. You need a thumb hole to do that. This drum doesn't have it. And these are the spins that are described in this kind of thing. So the fascinating thing is that this style of tambourine play became so popular, as I was mentioning, that it became part of the middle class education. But also it spread everywhere where the British Empire was, right? So this again kind of was a bit mind-blowing for me because it kind of connected to so many other universes that I had no idea were connected to the tambourine, first of all. So we both live in Ireland. And in Ireland they have a drum called the bowron. Are you familiar with the bowron? Right, so the bowron everybody thinks is this ancient, mythical, prehistorical drum. No, it's not. One of the most kind of theories of where the bowron came from is this. Because the bowron was called tambourine until very recently. It's a 20th century instrument, and it had jingles, and it was played with hands. Now I'll show you a picture. This is how a bowron was until not such a long time ago. Is a color photo. So you see, first of all, the thumb hole, which they don't have anymore. They had no crossbars and all that kind of stuff. The jingles, it's a tambourine to all effects. And if you go to certain parts of Ireland nowadays, they still play bowron with hands. The tipper came later, the stick, that they use. And the way they play the bowron by hand, it's a very peculiar way of hitting the drum with your knuckles. Something like this. When you look at the tipper, the way they added the tipper is very similar to this. It's an extension to try to get more volume of this kind of technique. Now, this kind of knuckle technique, it's exactly described in those treatises. Exactly. So there are videos of these guys in Ireland from the 60s and the 70s. They play, they also do all these thrills, we call this, with the thumb and with the fingers, also exactly described in these treatises. So that's already a link. Another link is to look at some of these drums in the Caribbean, which is obviously where the English went as well. And there are plenty. In the Dominica, there is another picture there. So this is from 1779. You can see a tambourine up there. Still nowadays in Dominica, there is a couple of sets of drums. One of them looks exactly like the bowron, and is played also exactly like this. So again, you're just kind of trying to tie all these lines and connect it.
And did you want to say that this is also dedicated to a lieutenant of the Coldstream Guards?
Yeah, you were reading something about this, right?
Yeah,
Do you want to say?
this was dedicated. You can't see it because I've edited it, but it's the painter who was Italian, by the way, the printmaker. Go figure. Dedicated this to a lieutenant and brigadier general of the Coldstream Guards, who has the dubious distinction of having had to surrender to Washington and Napoleon. So interesting. But, yet another, obviously the Coldstream Guards had these players in the band, so obviously this guy knew he would be interested. You know what I mean? So it's just, there's all of these.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of this connection. So going back to the treatises.
And he was also Irish. Half Irish and half Portuguese.
Oh yeah, you were saying it was yeah. This is all the stuff we read today on the airplane, by the way.
It's fascinating.
We discovered
anyway,
new stuff. But going back to the treatise, because my original quest was to connect it to where I come from, right? And I hadn't gone that far yet. I'd done Ireland, I've done Caribbean, but there was one thing. So maybe look back at the treatise. We can see again. Yes. So you can see the first stroke, because there is a whole other side of the book where he explains exactly how each stroke is made. And it's very interesting because some of the most difficult ones, like the harmonic one, it says, for this one, you need an instructor. Because I'm not going to be able to explain it to you in words. That's basically what he says, right? And then the whole score is notated with this. But so the bass is this thing that you saw me do a minute ago. It's this. It's described precisely 100% with, it even says you might need to use some rosin to make the skin a little bit more, to get a little more friction. And this is like all over the place. Now it sounds like a joke, a little bit like a trick. But in the scores, this is literally like 20% of the playing is this boom, 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 boom type of sound, which I don't know where it comes from. Richard, this guy that we've been talking to, says that in West Africa there is this friction drum tradition is very big. So this is one of his theories of how this sort of African side influenced some of this playing, Now, what I know is that there is one region in Italy where they do exactly that sound. So that was immediately like, oh, okay. And that's, maybe we can show the map of Italy there, because now I'm going to talk about Italy for a bit. This is Italy. You've seen it before. So the tambourine is played pretty much everywhere from center north all the way to the south. It's traditional. Every region has got a different style. I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute. This kind of playing comes from a region called the Marche, which is center north to the right. Can you see it? It's kind of reddish. Ancona, Marche. So it's quite north for tambourine. There are not many other tambourines in the north. And it's a style that is quite different from all the southern styles. Like a particular feature of that style, they have a dance music called salterello, which is a fast 6/8, a little bit like tarantella, and they play like this with this kind of bouncy technique. But then once in a while, out of the blue, they start doing this. And once in a while, out of the blue, completely unrelated, they start doing this. exactly the same technique that the Irish did, exactly the same technique described in those books. So, mind you, another thing described in the treatise is what they call the staccato, which is this. Exactly like this. Then finger rolls and also thumb rolls like this. They're traditional both in the marche and in their treatises. And the thing that mind-blowing me the most is that I found this video. This is not where I'm from. I grew up in Torino in the north. My family is from Sicily, so I'm more familiar with those styles. But I saw a video of this guy from the Marche that shows all these techniques, show all of this, and then in the end he plays a little demonstration and he just hits the drum, which by the way is a thumb hole. Only drum in Italy with a thumb hole comes from the Marche. All the other drums don't have thumb holes. He hits the drum like this, the drum spins like 15 times around his finger, and then he catches it, and I'm like, oh my God, this is it. You know, it cannot be a coincidence, right? The instruments look very similar. I don't remember, no, I'll show you in a second because I think that's later. So I'm going to open a parenthesis. This is one of those lectures that it's a bit like the never-ending story, you know? You remember that book? As everything started, a new possible lecture, so I'll try to keep it short and you have to keep time on me. Because I wanted to open a little parenthesis about Italian frame drums and also frame drums in general, right? So the tambourine belongs to the family of frame drums. The definition of a frame drum is a drum in which the diameter is larger than the width. And there are instruments that are quite old. The oldest iconographies we have is from about 6,000 before Christ. They're like statuines from Central Asia of female figurines like holding a drum. And we know now they were probably associated with fertility rites. And we have this throughout millennia. You see them in Central Asia, you see them in Mesopotamian cultures, you see them all the way to ancient Egyptian cultures. I think I have a picture of that. No, that's the Italian stuff. Go maybe further. There, that's an Egyptian frame drum. And then they appear on the Mediterranean, you know, around this time. There's lots of iconography from Roman Greek times, and this is probably the time where the frame drum started acquiring jingles. So maybe show us the next one. This is on a Greek kind of style vase, and it's from Sicily, because you know Sicily at the time was Greek. And you can quite clearly see that the drum has got probably jingles of some sort, bells. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's quite a lot to talk about. But during Greek-Roman times, so the drum became very popular in the Mediterranean area. And one of the theories, and look at the comparison is interesting, is that the Roman Empire, which was the biggest empire at the time, spread the drum everywhere in the Mediterranean. Same story as the English guys, right? So this drum traditionally now exists pretty much everywhere in the Mediterranean. In southern Italy, in Spain, there's a huge tambourine traditions, and they're quite connected to the Italian ones. In North Africa, in the Middle East, in Greece, they all have frame drums with and without jingles, everywhere. There are different styles, but they obviously come from the same source, you know, to a certain extent. So when we go to Italy, maybe let's go back to Italy for a second. So the tambourines, as I was saying, they are widespread pretty much from center north, from above Rome, all the way to the south. And they have very, very different styles. We call this tamburello, which means tambourine, and is very often associated with tarantella music. Now, I don't know what you know about tarantella. Tarantella, I mean, you know, it's one of those terms that is used a lot, and especially if you watch The Godfather and you remember, you know, the wedding scene. It's not exactly that, but it's a bit of a stylized version of tarantella, which became popular in the 19th century. But what a lot of people don't know is that tarantellas were used as curative rites for the bite of the spider. And this is something that was happening in Puglia until 1960s, last time observed in 1960s. So the idea was that you get bitten by a taranta. It's a type of spider. It's not really a tarantula, it's much smaller, but they call it taranta. And the city is called Taranto. Can you see Puglia there, Apulia? I don't know if you can read it. That's the heel of the boot, Taranto. Do you see that? And so that's where the word comes from. So they believed that the only way to get rid of the poison was through trance dancing. It was a healing trance dance ritual, right? So if you were bitten by the spider, your family called the musician, the doctor. The doctor came at home with the drum and brought the musicians. The musician moved into your home and they played music and you were dancing until you were healed, you know? And this has been there like from the Middle Ages. We have descriptions of this. You know, it was probably came from the Greeks, who were very fond of trance dancing, but that's a whole other lecture. So in the Middle Ages, we have descriptions of this. In the Renaissance times, in Baroque times, people even transcribe some of the melodies that they used for healing, you know. And like I said, the last time in the 1960s. Now, in Puglia, this music is called pizzica. Pizzicare means to bite. And they have a very particular tambourine styles. Maybe I can show you a couple of different ways they do. So all tarantellas usually have a very lively 6/8 feel, a bit like a jig with turbo boost, I always say. So in Puglia, they have a particular way of playing really fast triplets, that's what they are, by hitting the drum. So it's 3 strokes every time. It's like 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It's very hard to do slow. Now, what happens is that the drum bounces on your hand as you get speed. So it goes like this. That's the idea, and it goes on for a week usually. The healing treatment could last literally up to a week. It's insane. And the drum was the most important instrument, you know. So you can show some of these photos. These are traditional drums, quite rough, quite big. From the 1960s, this was the last time I was telling you this was observed. And now, interesting thing is that 2 women playing, because a frame drum is actually, historically, in most of the iconography, I mean, I would say literally 98% played by women. So originally, it was probably the religious association, you know, as I mentioned before, with fertility goddesses and priestesses and rites. Later on, I'm not sure. I mean, there are theories as well that they say that we have a lot of iconography of women because it was religious. It doesn't mean that men didn't play the frame drums, but we definitely have more imagery of that, you know. And until fairly recently, in a lot of Mediterranean tradition, they're still very much associated with women playing frame drumming. So these are 2 traditional players that were recorded in the 1960s. And in the next one, you can see this is the ritual of tarantismo, as they call it. So the woman is the one, the tarantata, she's been bitten. And the drummer, which is the same woman that you saw before. And there is a violin player and a kind of an accordion box player. So yeah, it has had a lot of revivals in the last 20 years. You know, it has become a hippie thing now. They call it neo-tarantismo, you know. So when I was growing up, sort of hippies were playing djembes and bongos. Now they're all playing tamburellos and dancing pizzica. So anyway, that's another lecture. So what's after this? Yes, so I wanted to try to go back to Rhiannon now and reconnect these ideas, you know, which is another thing that really occurred to me. So this is a traditional drum from the Marche. As you can see, it's quite different from what you just saw. So first of all, it's got a thumb hole, like I was mentioning, and it's got this particular tuning system, which is really old apparently. Now these new drums are fancy. They've got inbuilt tuning systems inside, because those kind of things are not great for your hands when they stick out like this. But when I first saw her banjo, I was like, hang on a sec, I've seen that before, that kind of stuff. And these tuning systems existed already in the 17th century. In Italy, we have iconography of frame drums with that kind of, you know, hook, like really early on, 17th century. And I thought, we went to see a museum. Do you remember where was this? Was it in Boston? I don't remember.
I think it was Boston.
Yeah, Rhiannon got to play one of these original banjos from the 1840s. And I saw it and I was like, I've seen that, for sure. And I mean, there's no need to explain it. It's so obviously related, right? This is traditional tamburello from the Marche again, this missing link of the Marche, and an early minstrel banjo. So I was like, actually, if you look at that, doesn't it just look like a frame drum with a stick? Really? And I think from now on, I'll leave it to Rhiannon, because that's her part of the story. Thank you.
So we're going to come back to kind of the conclusions that we've been drawing from these discoveries. But first, I have to take you through the banjo, because unfortunately, I'm not starting from scratch with the banjo. I have to undo some things with the banjo. Now, I don't know what you guys know and what you don't know. I generally find it's easier just to start at the top. So if that's okay, we're just gonna, because I just feel like it'll make more sense than the rest of it. So we have the beginning, which is the banjo ancestors, instruments from West Africa, jelly or griot instruments and folk instruments both went into the banjo. That's a ngoni. And then the next thing you have is the plantation banjo. So these West African instruments, the memories of them, the instruments themselves, they sort of amalgamated into what we call the banjo, the banza, there's lots of different terms, but they all kind of sound banjo-ish, and that happens in the Caribbean. It becomes the plantation banjo. These are handmade instruments, gourds that are, then created into what becomes the banjo. After that, you have the first commercial style banjo, and this is the first time that white folks pick it up. And it's part of the minstrel show. More about that in a minute. And then you have, there's a couple of different offshoots, right? So you have, I call it the city banjo. This is my own personal way that I think about the banjo. So you have the urban banjo, jazz, and sort of it goes off into this offshoot. And then from there you have the Irish banjo, the four-string Irish banjo. You go back to the minstrel banjo, it also goes to the mountain banjo. So these are homemade instruments in the mountains or in rural areas by whites and blacks. And then you have all of that kind of going into the bluegrass banjo, right? Which is what most people know of the banjo today, is the very end, right? So that's just kind of a basic overview. So, there were lots of different West African instruments. You've got, those are more like griot instruments. That's a folk instrument. That's a konting, which is what I studied briefly when I went to the Gambia, and I played the konting, and the right hand technique is exactly the same. I didn't have to change a thing, So the claw hammer style, which is kind of called the older style, like bluegrass is the kind of up picking thing that most people have heard, but the older style is really quite connected to a lot of African styles of playing. I was kind of shocked when I went, and I was like, oh my gosh, now the left hand is a total mess, but the right hand, I actually, I already know what I'm doing. This is amazing. So this is the very first, or the oldest extant example of a gourd banjo in existence. It's in Holland because it's from Suriname. And just to show you the scale, that's it up there in the case. So it's actually quite small. But I did get to, we both got to visit it late, was it this year or last year? And it was last year. And that was amazing to see that in the flesh. But, these were, beautifully made instruments that I don't know what that sounded like, but I'd like to think it was lovely. Okay, so now we have to kind of get into the landscape of the beginning of American music, because this is where the story has gotten really confused, right? So we're going to go back to the Negro fiddler, right? So the idea of music and who was playing the music has been a bit skewed. This is, I don't need to read all of this, but if during the 18th, 19th centuries, black fiddlers could be found throughout America. They routinely provided the music for dancing at social functions. They were considered servants. And as with so many other aspects of being a servant, that lot fell to black people, fell to African Americans everywhere. Right, so the dance musician, and that's what music was primarily used for, was for entertainment, i.e. dancing, because that was like really one of the main forms of entertainment before electricity. It was like people would dance all night, and they needed bands. So this was very, very common, and it was very common everywhere. And to be a fiddler as an enslaved person was a value beyond many other things, because you could make money with your fiddle. And so there's a lot of escaped slave notices that mention has a fiddle, has his fiddle, took his fiddle. right? So this was like, cash and carry. This was like, I can do something, so it was very highly regarded to be a musician on a plantation, particularly a fiddler. Now, banjo was more of sort of for the home team, at this point. White people aren't playing the banjo, but I thought I had another, anyway, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so that leads us to the Black String Band, because the fiddle and banjo come together with African American musicians, right? And that has a precedence in Africa, where these lute-type instruments are played with fiddles, because there are many instruments that are basically one-string fiddles that have been played all over, that had been played for years before people were brought to the Americas. So they played for everything, the Black String Bands. They played for the dances. They were taught, these fiddlers in particular, they were taught European tunes, and then that would get incorporated with however they felt like playing them. And so you had the process of creolization starting as soon as Africans set foot on, in the Caribbean and South America and North America. It starts because you have obviously people from all over. There's this idea of the monolithic slave. Well, first of all, they weren't slaves, they were enslaved, right? And they were people before they were enslaved. So they were priests, they were queens, they were, servants, they were people, and they were coming from all over, and they had different, so automatically you have this process of that characterizes African American culture, which is you take something and you make something new, because you have to, you have to communicate, and music is one of those ways that people can communicate. So, this kind of continues throughout early American music. So, as early as 1756, a fiddle and banjo were played along with a tambourine and drums as accompaniment to singing and dancing in an African American celebration in Rhode Island. And that's the other thing. It wasn't just the South. We were everywhere, playing for everything, And I can't really overstress that. It was for every function. And I love this quote, I believe they have danced and drunk till there are a few sober people amongst them. I am sorry I was not able to join them. Looks like a pretty good time. So Black String Bands, this is what they look like. That's Joe Thompson. He was my teacher. He's my mentor. He was the last black fiddler of that tradition, passed down as an oral tradition in the South. He lived 40 minutes away from my hometown, and in a very small town that I went to for family reunions every year. Didn't know he was there until I was an adult. He was 86, but I'm better late than never. So that's the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, Howard Armstrong, who he died at 92, an amazing fiddler. He played rural and urban styles. These guys were clearly hired to entertain those folks. And it could be any configuration. There, we've got a wind instrument there. It was, there's the triangle on that last one. There's the washtub bass. But they were everywhere, right? There's a box there, squeeze box, also called a wind jammer, which I love that. Banjo, fife, or some sort of flute-type instrument. Jug. And I had to put that in there. Because we kind of resurrected the Black String Band. This is the Carolina Chocolate Drops. That was my first band. And we basically took Joe Thompson's tunes, and sort of tried to take them wherever we went, to remind people of the tradition. So you have this Black String Band tradition, and it is kind of service-oriented. But you have all of these things kind of mixing together. You have European music, you have African music, you have all of these things sort of, mixing and becoming this thing that these bands are playing for Highland Flings. They're playing for, there's, again, whole nother lecture on that. And then you have the white community kind of going, hey, that's cool. Let's do that. So you have the minstrel banjo. And this is the first commercial style. So Joel Sweeney is the first white guy that usually is credited with playing the banjo. A lot of people like to try to say that he invented the short string, which is not true, because the short string is part of many African instruments and many of the ancestors of the banjo. It's the drone string, and it's one of the characteristics that makes it so special. So you have the minstrel banjo, and that's William Sidney Mott, a really important painter who got a lot of details of musicians of his time that we can really pull from. And then, unfortunately, along with the minstrel banjo, why it's called the minstrel banjo is you have blackface minstrelsy, right? So this becomes really popular. Blackface minstrelsy is the most popular form of American entertainment for like over 80 years. It's huge. It's exported everywhere. It's exported to anywhere that there's English, empire has touched, minstrelsy goes. And becomes really popular. You have the Prime Minister of Australia, picture of him blacked up with his minstrel troupe. They were everywhere. The UK, anybody see the black and white minstrel show? I mean, it went on to the 70s on TV. 1970s, right? So it was a really big deal. And so you have white entertainers putting on blackface, and like these are from sheet music, and they always did both to prove, this is what I really look like, and then here's my character. So there's often, you have them side by side. After emancipation, you have a lot of black entertainers who want to get into the biz. The only way they can do that is to buy into minstrelsy. A lot of them actually have to put on blackface, like black people putting on blackface. So, which is really weird to me, because I think about black people basically putting on blackface, pretending to be white people, pretending to be black, basically. People started to figure it out and started going, something's not right. Maybe that shouldn't happen anymore. Anyway, so minstrelsy becomes, it becomes a little bit not cool anymore, towards the end of the century, and it goes underground, basically, and it pops up in things like cartoons and movies. Mickey Mouse is not wearing white gloves just 'cause, So it's in like every aspect of our culture, and it'll come back again for a second. But and then also it's just people really thought of it as it was thought of as like the very first indigenous American export. Like indigenous American culture, if you ignore like the thousands of years of actual indigenous American culture, but that is often the case. No, it was considered like, this is this new upstart country's like thing is minstrelsy. It was like 100 years before rock and roll, this was the American cultural export that drove people crazy. But you see here's a regular couple. Not in blackface or anything, but these instruments are very important. So we have the minstrel banjo, the tambourine, and then the jawbone, which was a very popular, the donkey jawbone, like you use anyway, that's a whole nother. So, and it's also, I can't really get into this very much, but minstrelsy is not a monolith either. So it went on for a very long time, and in the beginning, it was very much a working class. A lot of the early minstrels were Irish, or Irish descendants. And there was this idea of using minstrelsy as mask work for working class solidarity, and then all the music that's going into minstrelsy is itself already a pinging back and forth between cultures. There is a triangle between the Caribbean, the United States, and Ireland that's going on. Again, can't get too far into it, but it's already a cultural mix of the music that's going into minstrelsy. And the music that went into minstrelsy is what is often forgotten when we talk about minstrelsy, because it's so hard, because these images, are really hard. But we can't let them obscure the fact that this is, a lot of this music is at the heart of everything that goes after. right? So this is what, I'm trying to do, and making these connections with Francesco has really pushed that, in a very positive way.
I mean, I wanted to say, the
Yeah.
first time that I heard those tunes that we played at the beginning, I had no idea what this music was. And she showed me this treatise of banjo tunes from the minstrel era, and I was like, every tune, it was like proto-20th century American music. I mean, this is mid-19th century, and I could hear rock and roll, I could hear blues, I could hear ragtime, I could hear Africa. All of this condensed into this. And, like you said, this is definitely not to be forgotten.
And we've been playing these tunes, for years now. Just slip them into the show, play a couple instrumental tunes, and people love them. They sound fresh. They sound now because they are, this mixture of, what America is. Anyway, this is not a lecture on minstrelsy, but it's really important. So this is just the how much woven into the fabric it is. There was a showboat started in 1932. What could we do that would make us not be depressed and be more interesting and uplifting? What could we do? What kind of entertainment can we do that men, women, and even children from all walks of life could participate in? That would be minstrelsy, right? And it went on until the 1977. There are lots of places around the country where this really hung on, I can't overstress it. So anyway, you also have a whole tradition that's coming out in the Appalachians, in rural areas, blacks and whites, right? But this is all becoming into where we're going. But there's all these images which are more of what we used to seeing with the banjo, right? So, and just really briefly, you have the whole jazz offshoot of the banjo. You lose a string, you got 4 strings. You gain 2 strings, you got 6-string banjo. You've got New Orleans banjo, Don Vappy, an amazing 4-string Creole banjoist. So there's all of that, right? You have banjo orchestras, where you have all different kinds of banjos. See that big bass banjo there. They were doing classical music arranged for banjos, right? I have a piccolo banjo. It's like this big. I have a banjarine, a soprano banjo. I have a cello banjo. I don't have a bass banjo. Every Ivy had a banjo club, And then you have the bluegrass banjo, which is where a lot of people start, is the idea of bluegrass music. Those are all my banjos in the back there. So what happened, So, and it's just an overview. So, 16 to 1820s, it's solely known as a black instrument. I mean, it is the emblem of black people in the Americas. And then you have this shift to it becomes a commercial instrument. White people start to pick it up, and it's kind of everybody's playing it, but it's still considered black music in a lot of places, right? Especially the minstrelsy as a commercial art form. And the rural and then the rural areas are starting to grow, what is going to turn into bluegrass and Appalachian styles of music, and you have it turn into basically a white instrument, and where people don't even know it was a black instrument. It's a complete and total shift. So I did this little. But look how long it was black, y'all. Right? Look how long it was gray. Right? So it's actually only the last chunk. So, I mean, it's a long history. It's very, very deep, and it's very tied into a lot of things that are wrong with this country. All right, so how did we get from the old plantation, which is what that painting is called, you see that banjo there, to deliverance? As the idea of what the banjo is, right? This is the freaking thing I hear all the time. Can you play dueling banjos? No. So what happens, we had a rapid recharacterization of the banjo. Was this coincidence? No, right? So as far as I can tell, look, I'm an amateur too. I mean, this is just me reading and trying to make sense of this, because when I started out as a banjo player, I was like sneaking in the back door. I was like, can I play this? You know, I didn't know the history. And then I started to learn the history, and then I went, wait a minute, why don't I know this? You know, because it proves that it's everybody's instrument. It's not anybody's, you know, nobody owns it. You know, it's really, truly an American instrument. But anyway, so I figured out there are three main reasons why this shift happened. So you have the Great Migration. 6 million African Americans travel from the South to the North and the West. You have the birth of the recording industry, and we'll get into that in a second. And our old friend, white supremacy. So of course, Great Migration, that's the most known quantity here. It's a massive movement of people and culture to other parts of the country, but it didn't drain the South of black people. We were still there, you know, and that's an important thing to remember. And then you have the birth of the recording industry. So in the 1920s, you have the invention of the phonograph, the records, you know, and the idea that you can capture music and then sell it, right? So they start, we're focusing on Colombia right now. They start selling ethnic music to ethnic people, you know, big old air quotes there. That's Greek music. There's Discos Colombia. That's Norwegian music. So they had all these they were selling to all the different groups in America. And then you have Old Familiar Tunes, which is the hillbilly division, and then race records. So this is this is the very beginning of the recording industry. What do you see today? What do you see there? You see today, right? You see the Grammys, right? And then you have somebody named Ralph Peer, who, among other people, but he's one of the most well-known, he was an A&R person, you know, and he worked for these record companies, and he was trying to learn how to sell more records to more people, which is what, you know, it's what capitalism is all about. So he is quoted saying that he invented that, right? He's not the only one, but he's one of the main, and he, you know, there's a lot of good stuff that he did, because the idea of, you know, this is like regular people's music. This isn't classical music. This isn't sheet music. This is like regular people's making music. So it's great that so much of this was captured, but in doing it in this way, it became very much a siloed, it became, it became, it's segregated, basically, American music. So it was very important to be in the right category, even way back in the beginning. And this is what always kind of gets me. Nonetheless, these white artists recognized the importance to the music industry of maintaining racial distinctions, a fact made clear by the Allen Brothers' 1927 lawsuit against Columbia Records for $250,000 in 1927. $250,000 for damaging their reputations by issuing their recordings of Chattanooga Blues as part of its race series. Right? They said that they were afraid they weren't going to get jobs in vaudeville if people thought they were black. So from the very beginning, you know, what they would do is they would put ads in the paper, and they'd say, we want to record all the local music. White people come on this day, black people come on this day. Like, I kid you not. You know, and if you're a black string band musician, of which there were still quite a few in the 1920s, and you learn that they want you to play blues, what you gonna do? You're going to learn some blues. So there were very few black string band and black string musicians that were recorded. There were some, thankfully. You know, and there were some integrated sessions, you know, the Jimmy Rogers Blue Yodel number, I can't remember which one has Louis Armstrong on it. You know, there were some of these integrated sessions, weren't very many. And there weren't very many black string musicians recorded. So, you know, what happens is that what's recorded is what's remembered. Right? And you have to, when you have to go digging, a lot of times you don't do it. So it really leads to the segregation of American music. I love this quote. In terms of their actual consumption patterns, Southern record buyers of the 1920s were far more omnivorous than record company executives generally seemed to comprehend. And interviews with elderly black and white musicians reveal that many of them purchased records intended specifically for sale to other racial and even foreign language ethnic groups. Still, much of this appears to have been lost on talking machine firms, which focused their promotional efforts on marketing race records to African Americans and hillbilly records to rural and working class white Southerners. Because at this time, there was still an overall vocabulary of Southern music. There was an overall list of tunes that everybody knew, right? Everybody could play these tunes. Everybody knew these tunes. And here you have the start of the separation. So that leads us to number 3, the creation of a false white American cultural narrative, which is getting us back to where we started off, right? So you have square dancing. A 1927 newspaper advertisement for Columbia's Familiar Tunes Old and New series, remember that, the hillbilly record picture, for example, promised to satisfy the musical taste of those record buyers who get tired of modern dance music, foxtrots, jazz, Charleston, and long for the good old barn dances and the Saturday night music of the South and plantation days. This is how they advertised this series. Neglecting, I love this picture in particular because there's a jug player, black tradition. There's a fiddle player, which is also a black tradition. There is a caller, which I find out was also a black tradition, right? Calling is what sets apart square dancing and quadrilles from Europe. So square dancing uses a lot of the figures from European dances, and the thing that sets it apart is the calling. Many Europeans came over and they talked about square dancing, and they always remarked on how weird the calling was because it just wasn't done over there. You had to learn the dance. There were dancing masters making their living, teaching people how to do these dances. So you went to the dance already knowing how to do it. In America, it's a little bit more rough and ready, right? You might not always have a dance master. And so these black musicians who were leading the dance because they were the band started calling the figures and doing it in a way that slots right into the call and response aspect of so much African music. And there's lots of other, Phil Jamieson could tell you a lot more because he's the academic who I learned this from. So I'm sitting here going, okay, so you want to go back to the days of the old plantation? Well, you know, a lot of those people would have been black, you know? And so it's just really, really, so this starts to happen. And there are some culprits here. There is Cecil Sharp, who was an English song collector, and what he wanted to do was to prove the unbroken, unblemished tradition of English music back to the Appalachian Mountains. So he went to the Appalachian Mountains in the early 1900s to collect songs. And you have Henry Ford. Okay. You have Henry Ford, who we all know, you know, the capitalist supreme, and streamlining and all this kind of stuff, the car. But he was also a xenophobe and racist. And he was very invested in this idea of square dance being cast as an ethnically white American dance form. And he started really agitating to have that taught. You know, I mean, I remember square dancing in middle school, in the gym. This is where all of that comes from, this idea that this is this white ethnic, you know, creation. John Powell, who was also a white supremacist and who started a famous folk festival. So these folks had very strong vision of what American music was and what it was not. And so we have to remember is that these narratives are created by people with an agenda. And that's the thing that kind of blew me away the most. It doesn't happen by accident that in 30 years you have a complete turnaround for how you look at something like the banjo. This is really this is kind of indicative of what I mean. So they would go and they would find people, they would try to find these folks who could give them these ballads, you know. And so at this point, the proportion of African Americans living in rural areas was low, even though that wasn't always the case. You know, this is the start of the Great Migration, but up to 20% of people in Appalachia were African American for a long time. Carpellists claimed that there were practically no Negroes in the mountains. When they did encounter blacks, however, they intentionally avoided contact with them. While in western North Carolina, Carpellis wrote in her diary, "We arrived at a cove and got sight of log cabins that seemed just what we wanted, called at one a musical good morning, turned around and behold, he was a Negro. We had struck a Negro settlement, nothing for it but to toil back again." Referring to the same incident, Sharp wrote, "We tramped a very hard and warm walk, mainly uphill. When we reached the cove, we found it peopled entirely by all our trouble and spent energy for naught." And this man influenced everybody who came after. And he wrote about this music and these dance forms in a very particular way, and it really shaped a lot of. And he's very much revered. I mean, I'm sure he's done a lot of good work, of course. And for my purposes, I'm very annoyed at him. But he's very revered, and he started the Song Society, and I mean these people get into these positions and they really can influence a lot of people. Anyway, I'm taking too long. So then we have the creation of that power of media, right? Ebony Hillbillies, and that's the tune that was Earl Scruggs. That was the big blow up of bluegrass. Was one of the blow ups was the theme song to this show, and that's what a lot of people think of when they think of the banjo. And you have Pete Seeger, who was a wonderful, amazing musician, but also takes it down another road in terms of what folk music is. What does it sound like? Who gets to do it? And he was, of course, for everybody doing it, but that sound is what I'm talking about. And then you have some, like the Mumford and Sons, playing a banjo that's, for me, not connected to much tradition, but it's a very popular sound, and so people think that's the banjo. So the media is really powerful, but the thing is that, we have a selected bibliography, which we just have in case anybody's interested. But the thing is that if you look at what we're being told, we're being told that we're different, and we're being told that you like this and you like that, and there's no back and forth. When the history of American music is nothing but combinations of things. It's nothing but a cultural conversation between races, between castes, between different groups. It's nothing but that conversation. But the banjo is an excellent example of that. And the
drum. I mean, the stories I try to tell you are also kind of proving that point. Even the fact that I think is amazing that the frame drum probably influenced the construction of the modern banjo, right? Like the organology of the banjo. Go.
So, like, as we've been kind of digging into this, and I'm bringing my banjo and he's bringing the frame drum, what we're discovering even more and more is this idea that race is a construct, right? I mean, this is something that I just feel like doesn't get emphasized enough, that it's completely made up. The race is completely made up. There's no genetic difference, right, between races. The race is made up. The institutionalized results of living with that is not made up, right? This is the difference. The edifice is a real thing, right? But the underlying, the pseudoscience and all of that stuff. But the thing that what we're kind of discovering and want to emphasize is that, we know about the creation of the African American identity and all of that stuff, but we also have to remember that whiteness is also completely made up. And who gets to be white is also made up. And it changes. So we've talked about Irish people who were not considered white when they first came to the United States. They were called the same kind of names that black people were called, but usually with just potato in front. I kid you not, right? When Italians first came, most of them coming from Sicily, it's the same exact thing.
It's very fascinating. I've been reading a few books in the last airplane trips, talking about Italians when they first arrived here, and Sicilians in particular, And Sicilians were also at the very bottom of the scale. Yeah? And then I don't know if you're familiar with this part of history. In Louisiana, they lynched Sicilians. There's quite a few cases of this. And the whole thing was an operation, like we said. Things don't happen by chance. And the interesting thing is that the Sicilians were considered bottom in Italy as well, already by then. Nowadays, I don't know how much you know about Italy, but there is a huge divide between North and South. And Italy is not a very old country. It was made in 1861. Right? Before then, it was all tiny little states that were always fighting each other. So in 1861, Garibaldi annexed the south to the Savoy Kingdom, which was the north, right? Turin. And at that time, anyway, it's a long story, but basically, scientists started basically writing theories about Sicilians being an inferior race, saying that they were savages, that they were connected to Africa, because actually there is a very strong influence, obviously, of the Moors were in Sicily for a few hundreds of years, but that's another story. And basically, the Italian state, they wanted to get rid of Sicilians because it was the poorest part of the country. They didn't invest anything in it. and they started sending them to America. So we have documentation that proves that Louisiana and Mississippi made a deal with Italy to basically fool people into believing they were going to come to America to work the land, after which 20 years they were going to be able to buy the land, and that was a lie. They came there and they were basically considered the new slaves, because at that stage, obviously, slavery was over in theory, and they needed people to work the fields, you know? And so anyway, there's a lot of fascinating stories. I mean, just going back a few other steps, for me, all of these conversations, that, you know, all the stuff Rhiannon is telling you about has happened also in Europe to a certain extent way before. So my family comes from Sicily, and Sicily, like I mentioned a second ago, was dominated by Arabs, by the Moorish Empire, the end of the Middle Ages, which had a huge influence on everything European. Almost everything from the Renaissance onwards was immensely influenced by the Arab Empire, much more than the Greek. I mean, the Greek and the Arabs were very intertwined, you know, like a lot of the Greek classics of philosophy were translated into Latin via Arabic. And that's crazy. And that was completely erased. And you know when that happened? Pretty much in 1492. Same here, when all the stuff started happening on this side, you know. It's very interesting with the expulsions of... They Spain got finally rid of all the Moors, and then they did basically a cleansing, like methodical cleansing of they were never here. Literally. Everything, numbers, you know, we have Arabic numbers, right? Otherwise we will all be counting with X's and V's and I's. Like food, agriculture,
Instruments.
musical instruments. All of Western instruments came from the Arabic word. It's like, who talks about this stuff, you know? So it's a very interesting parallel to that sense of this idea of rewriting histories and deleting, you know, stuff that happened.
So, I mean, what we're finding, and we're wrapping it up because I know it's just too much. You know, the problem is that, you know, we're not asking the right questions, you know, when it comes to this music. You know, a lot of people are, but in terms of the general, you know, the idea of what we know in terms of, like, you know, everyday knowledge of this music is just like, there's so much excavating that has to be done. And for us, we're very grateful for all the academics, all the people who've been slogging through the research and publishing these amazing books that we're reading and sort of encapsulating, oh my God, horribly in one sentence, you know, for people to then go read, hopefully themselves. But what the overriding thing that we find through the music is that everything is a story, everything is a construction by somebody. You know, so the more that we know about what actually happened, the more that we can deconstruct that construction, that we can say, well, through this music, we find this. So why are you saying that this is what happened? You know what I mean? So this is all what we're trying to do with our music. And
I think as well, a very important thing when we talk about racism is the fact that, you know, you can talk about traditions and ethnics, all kinds of things, and those are not immutable things. They're like music. They're constantly fluid. They're constantly influenced by each other. Now, racism is based on the fact that you cannot change who you are, right? It's like the one drop blood laws, that kinds of concepts. You were born with this. And this happened in 1492 in Spain as well. They said, you have to go, all the Jews, all the Muslims, everyone, you can convert. But they actually invented the Inquisition for that reason, because they weren't really sure if you had a drop of Muslim blood, that wasn't good enough. It's immutable. So that's the concept, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, is that we're finding out how far back this stuff goes and how back it reaches. And by following the music, we're actually following that story. So it's just another way to look at it, and it's the tools that we have, you know, and it's how we look at it. I think we should probably wrap it up.
Yeah.
So we thought we could save the song for the end, maybe.
But yeah.
Or yeah, and do the Q&A now. But this is it's a work in progress, and so we're still finding out things kind of every day. But thanks.
Hello, hello. Hi, good evening. So I'm Daniel Murray. I'm the executive director at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Sitting here, though, hearing all of these stories, we've gotten some demonstrations. One of the things we're really excited about your work, both in this talk and the album and much of your work, is this commitment to research discovery, but also the kind of transformation that happens in the creative process when you turn that into something new. You talked about these old pieces still have life, but also there's something that you're bringing to that too. I was wondering if you could give us an example of that, sort of talk about how that process, that creative process, mix into it, and maybe play us an example. On your new album, you have a lot of these great old tunes that you've transformed.
I don't know.
Do you want to play the tune that you wanted to do, the two tunes?
Which one?
The two tunes with the fiddle.
It's not on the record, but we've been kind of experimenting, from a instinctual point of view, like just from a musical point of view, and then we find afterwards we find historical reasons, and connections, which is kind of amazing.
But it's not premeditated.
No.
It's like, because we both have so much experience with playing different instruments and different styles, like we said at the beginning, she played this tune and I heard those sounds and I had no idea of what we were about to embark on, And then later we discovered, maybe there's a reason why this worked.
Yeah.
So it's very much based on that process.
So we'll play a couple of tunes, as I know we didn't play very much, but look, when we do our show, we do talk a bit, but we play a lot, We do play a lot, and we always try to reel the talking in, It's like they came here for the playing, not for the talking. So this is our chance to talk. So that's why we talk.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
So this is not on the record. This is a couple of tunes that I've learned kind of over the years. The first one is kind of one of the first tunes I learned by listening to the Pile Mountain Bobcats, which is a group from where I'm from. And then the second one is a black string band tune. And I don't know.
And I'm just playing some tambourines too.
Won't you come out tonight? Come out tonight, come out tonight. Won't you come out tonight? Dance by the light of the moon.
Thank you for that. All right, so we'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. We have a microphone roving around somewhere back here. How about we go right here? Yeah. Hold tight for the mic, please. Thanks.
Thank you. Are you aware of any efforts among statewide primary and secondary school textbook groups to reflect your messages today? I know I'm not naive on the question, but it's such a great way to address these issues without, or in a way that I think would resonate with kids.
I mean, I've wanted to do a study, I've wanted to do an educational component for a really long time. The Chocolate Drops used to do schools all the time. Never had the time to develop the materials because we were on the road, So it's definitely something that's been on my mind because I do think that it's an easy way in, I mean, for me, it was my way into the history. Like, I mean, I got a music degree. I didn't, my mom and my sister both have, my sister's, has a PhD. My mom's they've been talking about, feminism and history and African American, blah, blah, blah. And I was always like, I don't want to hear this, And then I got into the banjo and I realized how you can learn so much through the music. How I was understanding more about my grandparents by learning more about this music. So the short answer to your question is not that I know of. There's been a couple of people who've sort of said, this would be a great, and I'm like, yeah. I don't know how to do it, but that would be great.
We have another question right up in the front here.
Yeah, why don't you just take this?
So first of all, I wanted to say that I had a chance to see you on the Ken Burns country music thing, which you were terrific. I appreciated everything you had to say. But I just wanted to, and I really, really loved both of yours comments today. But I'm kind of I want your opinion on the Old Town Road taking of it off. Just wondering what you might have to say about that.
This will be interview number 45 about this song. The Old Town Road controversy, if anybody's not familiar with it, is that there was a black artist called Lil Nas X who came up with this song called Old Town Road. It hit the top of the country charts, and then they took it off for some reason. Even though it didn't sound any different than a lot of music that's already on commercial country radio. So and then Lil Nas X also shows up in a cowboy hat, and you have white people talking about cultural appropriation, and I'm like, no ma'am, no sir. We got to know some history here. There were a lot of black cowboys. It comes in part out of African American culture and also Mexican culture and Native culture. It's like, don't nobody own the cowboys. That's just what we've seen in the movies, and this is why representation is so important. This is why, knowing the power that the media has, right? So I think that it was ridiculous, but it's indicative of the industry. I wasn't surprised, But I think it's a great opportunity to talk about it. It's a great opportunity to, open up the question of, have there always been black people in country music? Yes. Does country music come in part from African American culture? Yes. But this is how hidden this stuff is that you have to start from scratch. And you're actually starting in a deficit because there is this false narrative that has been laid down with cement that we have to chip at. I've been chipping at this for like 13 years. And I'm tired, but I'm gonna keep going. So anyway, that's my answer to that.
I think we have another one in the back.
I was thinking about what was happening in the jazz world in the 1920s in Chicago while you were talking, mostly you, Rhiannon, and names that we recognize, like for example Benny Goodman. Actually, in a couple of the biographies of Benny, he talks about having secret black friends who would take him to the other side of Chicago so he could listen to the black music, because it wasn't acceptable for a Jewish boy to go there. But there was a lot of integration that happened pretty early compared to what I think I hear you talking about in terms of the minstrelsy kind of world. And I just, do you know about this? And if you do, what do you think about it?
I mean, there's been cultural crossing since the beginning. You know, there's cultural crossing between whites and blacks, working class. There's cultural crossing between blacks and Irish. Cultural crossing between blacks and Jewish people. You know, there's been cultural crossing between many different groups in music, and it's very, very, you know. And we were just reading about this, like especially in that time period, there was a lot of black and Jewish musical mixing that was going on. You know, and that
every songwriter of the standard songbook was Jewish. Every impresario of the jazz times, you know, from the 30s, 40s, 50s were Jewish. It was like we were
Guy
reading
wrote
this.
Strange Fruit. I mean,
we were reading this amazing quote about Gershwin, you know, obviously being a great example of him panicking the night before Porgy and Bess writing to a friend of his film composer, say, "Do you think Summertime sounds a bit too Yiddish?" Literally, you know.
yeah, I mean, the very first moving picture, like popular moving picture, was about a Jewish cantor's son in blackface, and a lot of black folks loved that movie. By the way,
it was very popular.
It was very popular. So it's way more complicated, you know, and which makes it more interesting, and actually makes it more beautiful, you know, because this is where this is what America is these stories, you know, and I, you know. The music, doing it with the music is kind of immutable. It's like here it is. What do you want? You know, there's a great story from Ethel Waters' autobiography where she talks about singing the song. Was it Eli? I can't remember quite. Which we find out actually was quite a popular song amongst other black artists
Billie
as well.
Holiday sang it as well.
Right?
It was a Yiddish song.
It was a Yiddish song. And she was asked to sing the song in Yiddish, and she sang it, and people loved it, and so they saw. You know, it was just like these stories are really important. You know, as even further, it's just the evidence. Once you start digging, it's like everywhere. That's why that narrative had to be so strong and so simplified, because it kept us from looking. Because they knew as soon as we started looking, it was like, oh, there it is, there it is, there it is. You know.
But in the history of jazz, for sure, I mean, especially in the early history of jazz, even in New Orleans, you know, it was like a complete multicultural chaos, you know. And obviously, like I think your point was obviously that, right? That it was like that until the recording industry really tried to compartmentalize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even within the industry, people are still trying. You know, there's so many examples of that even within the industry, and it just every time it starts to happen, it's like, Lil Nas X off the top. There it is.
I think we had another one right up here. Yeah.
So I had never heard of tarantela. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Tarantela. There is a style of flamenco called taranta, which is generally not danced. And a lot of the styles of flamenco that are not danced, I mean, according to different histories that I've read and my own teachers, these were like devotional music. They claimed this was devotional, it was spiritual music. Do you know of any? Is there a connection between this
There is, yeah.
Italian form and then this Iberian form?
Now, about the taranta, particularly in flamenco, I'm not sure, but I know that in the Iberian Peninsula they had tarantismo rituals as well. Exactly the same concept, bite of the spider, healing ritual, which is something which was widespread in the Mediterranean, and also the idea of trance dancing. I know for sure that there is a connection there. In terms of, I mean, flamenco is another incredibly interesting subject, you know, and it's only now in the last 20 years that people are starting to talk about the black influence on flamenco, you know, not just the gypsy, but also, you know, because it's like, again, 1492, everybody got kicked out, not just Jewish, you know what I mean? So it's very interesting, but I don't know exactly with the taranta in terms of the flamenco palos. Taranta, I'm not entirely sure.
And I wanted to add, actually, we're talking about the trance aspect of tambourine playing, which of course has a great correlation within black churches, you know, and the idea of trance and
women players,
and women playing
tambourine.
You know, the tambourine. So it's just like there's How many layers do we want, you know?
Hi, thank you so much. I would just love to hear your thoughts on how white musicians can play and sing this beautiful, powerful music in a way that honors its true home and its true origins, you know, because part of me says no one who's white should lay any claim, but also the other side of me says these are the songs that I love to sing that, you know, have such beautiful harmonies and power and history. And so I just would love to hear from someone like yourself about the best way to uplift and honor while paying tribute and being respectful.
Couple things I would say, and then I think you should say the quote that we were talking about earlier. That was a strong quote. You should talk about it. Yeah. Okay. So we had, well, but you know what I mean. We had to discuss for a second. So I get asked that a lot because I've done workshops. You know, I've taught spirituals and things like that. And this is my opinion: is that everybody has a story, and that's one of the saddest things about being white in America is that you were told that you have no culture. Because to become white, you have to get rid of it. Like, not saying that you don't have it, you know what I'm saying? But in terms of the construction of being white. So if you're Irish, you're coming into, what do you have to do? You have to give up your language, you have to give up this, you have to give up that to become a very narrow definition of what accepted whiteness is. And that's what I'm coming to as these people are coming to me going, it's in that I feel something that I don't feel like I have. And that's sad to me because it's not, I don't think it's true, right? But it's become such a thing now that people we're trying to reach outside to get this thing that we gave up like 200 years ago. You know what I mean? I'm oversimplifying, but that's kind of the thing that I'm sort of getting this feeling for. So what I feel like is that everybody has to find the connection to who they are themselves. You know, you have to find the connection to the song in you, and that means knowing who you are. You know, I'm not necessarily saying go to Ancestry.com, find out where, you know, four generations ago somebody came from, and then go and put in a kilt on. That's not what I'm talking about. You know, I mean, if that's what you want to do, go to, because they're cute. Kilts are cute. I like kilts, you know, but. My thing is that you have to figure out what your culture is. It's who you are. It's how you grew up. It's your family. It's where you're from. And if you find a connection in another culture that speaks to you, I'm like, just be legit with it. You know, I'm like, I don't mind people singing blues. I mind people singing blues like a 75-year-old, you know, a black man from Alabama, you know, from 1923. Don't do that. You know, sing the blues like you would sing it because you feel it. That's why you want to sing it. You know, I mean, and this goes across cultures. It goes across. It doesn't matter. You know, but you have to be legit about it. That's my thing. Is just be legit. You know, and like because I know this from the other side because I got really into Gaelic music from Scotland, right? So in the Highlands of Scotland they speak another language. It's Gaelic. In the Lowlands they speak a version of English, right? So there's lots of differences between the two groups, but it's still Scotland, you know. But their Highland culture is quite its own thing, and so I fell in love with the music because it reminded me of the powwow singing that I used to do in high school, right? I was in a powwow drum, and that was my connection, you know. So I went to Scottish music with I want to learn. I'm not trying to take your music. I'm trying to understand the connection that I feel to me. Right? So I went to Scotland. Now, I'm not saying you can always do that. I was lucky. I got to go and I studied with Gaelic-speaking people. Tried to learn about the culture, not to take it, but to understand where it was coming out of, you know, so that I could connect to it like I connect to it, not trying to sing like a native of Barra, you know? And so I would go to festivals because and I entered Gaelic singing competitions. You know, because it was interesting to me, and I have a respect for the language. And a lot of people there walking around in a kilt don't know a word of Gaelic, but say that they're Scottish and they have Highland ancestors, and they're like, "What are you doing here?" And I'm like, "I don't know. What are you doing here?" I mean, you know, there was not even getting into the fact that there were lots of black Gaelic speakers in North Carolina. Largest settlement of Scots Highlanders in the 1700s is in North Carolina, in what is now called Scotland County for some reason. But
James Fraser.
James Fraser,
The
right? That's
drummer
why I
there.
was kind of suspecting he might come from North Carolina. There was a black church in North Carolina who sent off for a Gaelic preacher because they spoke Gaelic, right? This is America. This is the interesting stories. And so through the music, I find that story. And I'm like, how interesting is that? Way more interesting than wearing a kilt, you know? Not saying there's anything wrong with it. Just saying, if that's your only connection to being Scottish, come on. There's a lot of cool things in the culture to connect to, you know? So anyway, I'm just saying I've come up from that side, so I understand. I really do. But it's like there's so many different, and culture, it's like he was saying, race and culture and all that stuff is not immutable. It changes. People have different ideas of what it is. They feel it different ways. That's a really long answer. I'm sorry. But you want to, can you?
No, I was reading again today. It was a long flight. There was a lot of reading. Louis Armstrong apparently was kind of helped by a Jewish family. Do you know this story? And kind of, he always said that he learned probably sense of music from them. And apparently even talked about scatting, because that's another big debate. Where did scat come from? You know, there's a lot of Irish people there going, it's ours, you know. But he said that it was connected to the cantorial singing and to a very Jewish way of singing. But what was the...
That was it.
I was really sure.
So I mean, but so you know, it's like...
I just like the real story is always so much more beautiful, isn't it? Than what they tell us.
I think that is a beautiful place to pause. So we want to, first of all, let's have another round for Rhiannon Giddens. Francesco.
We talked too long, sorry.
We have a few tokens of appreciation that we want to give to you.
Oh, heavens. Heavens to Murgatroyd.
Thank you both for such generosity and for enlightening us, and we really are grateful. So we have tokens of appreciation for you. And thanks to everyone. They will, I'm sure, be here to answer a few more questions afterwards. Thank you.
Flowers. Oh boy. Thank you.
Concert is tomorrow night at Bing Auditorium.
And there's a lot of smarties in this room. I can feel it. This is a work in progress. You know, this was a great opportunity for us to try to like put our thoughts together. But you know, if you have any thoughts about what you heard, and if it jives with you, if it doesn't jive with you, if you feel like there's a better way we could say things, please let us know, because like we're doing this on the fly. So thank you so much for being an amazing audience, and we really appreciate you guys letting us do this.
Thank you.